In the summer of 1967, the most important phone call in American television history came through for a black soul singer from Georgia. And 6 months later, that same phone call became the most heartbreaking thing his wife could not bring herself to talk about for decades because the Ed Sullivan Show had finally opened its doors to Otis Redding. And the night he was supposed to walk through them, his seat was empty. His name was still on the marquee. And somewhere at the bottom of a frozen Wisconsin lake, the greatest performance that stage never saw was gone forever. To understand what that phone call meant, you have to understand what the Ed Sullivan Show meant to black artists in 1967. This was not just a television program. It was the gatekeeper of mainstream American culture. If Ed Sullivan called your name, you existed to white America. If he did not, you could sell out every theater on the Chitlin circuit. You could make every black woman in Georgia cry at Sunday church. And white America would still walk right past you on the street without knowing your face. Elvis Presley had become a phenomenon on that stage. The Beatles had introduced themselves to 67 million Americans on that stage. The Rolling Stones had played that stage. And for years, Otis Redding had watched all of it from a distance, filling venues that those artists would never play, reaching audiences that those artists would never reach, pouring his entire soul into every note and still being told, quietly, systematically, without anyone ever saying it directly, that his music was not quite ready for a room like that. That changed on June 17th, 1967. Now, the Monterey International Pop Festival in California had been organized as a celebration of the counterculture. The lineup was stacked with rock royalty. The crowd was 50,000 strong, almost entirely white and almost entirely unfamiliar with what was about to happen to them. When Otis Redding walked onto that stage in a lime green suit, backed by Booker T and the MGs and the Memphis Horns, the audience gave him polite, uncertain applause. They did not know him. They were not sure what to expect. They were still coming down from watching Jimi Hendrix set his guitar on fire. What happened next has been described by people who were there as something between a religious experience and a natural disaster. Otis Redding did not ease that crowd in. He grabbed them by the throat from the very first note and did not let go for 30 minutes. He sang Shake. He sang Respect. He sang I have been loving you too long with such raw, desperate, aching honesty that 50,000 people who had come to see rock and roll fell completely and permanently in love with soul music. When he launched into his version of Satisfaction, the Rolling Stones song, and tore it apart from the inside out, replacing Mick Jagger's words with his own grunts and screams and ad-libs, the crowd understood something that nobody had ever explained to them before. They understood where the music had come from. They understood who had built it. The standing ovation lasted long after the curfew had hit. Security was trying to shut the show down and the crowd would not move. The phone rang the next morning. It was the Ed Sullivan Show. Otis Redding took that call in a hotel room in California and for a few minutes just sat there after hanging up, holding the receiver, staring at the wall. His road manager, Earl Sims, would later say he had never seen Otis look like that before. Not nervous, not excited, something quieter than both of those things. Like a man who had been running for a very long time and had finally spotted the finish line. Because that is exactly what the Ed Sullivan Show represented. Not money, not fame, not a number on a chart. It was the moment when the system that had told black artists for decades that they were not quite right for primetime television finally looked Otis Redding in the eye and said, "We were wrong. Come on in." But the body does not stop paying its debts just because the moment is right. Months of screaming into microphones, of giving every performance everything he had and then finding more to give had left Otis Redding with polyps on his vocal cords. The doctors told him he needed surgery. They told him he needed silence. The man who sang like breathing was not enough to stay alive was ordered to stop making any sound at all for weeks. He sat in that silence and he listened differently than he ever had before. He put on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album and listened to it like a student, not a rival. He listened to Bob Dylan. He thought about architecture, about what it would feel like to build a song the way you build a house, from the foundation up, room by room, with intention in every corner. He had spent his entire career singing at full volume, giving everything, burning white hot every single night. And now the silence was teaching him something he had never had the space to learn. That a whisper can reach further than a scream. That stillness can hit harder than fury. That the most devastating thing a human voice can do is not shout, it is stop. Concert promoter Bill Graham offered him the use of a houseboat in Sausalito, California. For 4 days, Otis Redding sat on the dock of that houseboat and did nothing. He watched the ferries cross Richardson Bay. He watched the ships come in from the Pacific and roll back out again. He listened to the seagulls and the water lapping against the hull and the sound of a world that kept moving whether you were ready or not. His road manager Earl Sims sat with him and watched him stare at the water for hours at a time. On a scrap of paper, Otis wrote 2 lines. He did not know yet what they were the beginning of. He just wrote them down because they were true. Sitting in the morning sun, I will be sitting when the evening comes, watching the ships roll in. Then I watched them roll away again. He folded that piece of paper and put it in his pocket and carried it with him for months, through the surgery, through the recovery, through the string of concerts and the television appearances and the magazine covers that all came pouring in after Monterey. The whole music industry had suddenly decided that Otis Redding was the most important artist in America. Everyone wanted a piece of what they had ignored for years. And through all of it, the Ed Sullivan Show date sat on his calendar like a lighthouse, something to aim for, something that meant the crossing was almost complete. Now in November of 1967, Otis flew to Memphis and called Steve Cropper. He told him he had something. In 30 minutes inside Stax Studios, they shaped those houseboat fragments into a complete song. Cropper added a line that got straight to the bone. I left my home in Georgia, headed for the Frisco Bay. That was not poetry. That was Otis Redding's actual life. The boy from the cotton fields of Dawson who had traveled 3,000 miles and sat on a dock wondering what it all meant. They recorded it on December 7th, 1967. At the very end, Otis forgot what he was going to say. So instead he just whistled. A soft, wandering, melancholy little melody that drifted off into silence. He told Cropper he would come back and finish it properly. He told the room this was going to be his first #1 single. And he said it with the kind of certainty that does not leave room for doubt. 3 days later, on December 10th, 1967, Otis Redding boarded his twin-engine Beechcraft H-18 airplane in Cleveland, Ohio. The weather was terrible. Fog, rain, and low visibility hung over the entire Midwest. The plane had a battery that was not producing full power. James Brown had warned him about that aircraft months earlier, told him it was too small and too old for the schedule Otis was keeping. But there was a show in Madison, Wisconsin. There were people who had bought tickets. Otis Redding did not cancel. At 3:28 in the afternoon, 4 miles from the runway at Dane County Regional Airport, the plane went down into the frozen waters of Lake Monona. Otis Redding was 26 years old, and the Ed Sullivan Show appearance was scheduled for the following spring. The producers of the Ed Sullivan Show did not cancel Otis Redding's slot immediately. For a few days after the crash, his name was still in the scheduling notes, still on paper, still a plan that the world had not caught up to yet. When they finally removed it, one of the producers reportedly sat in his office for a long time without saying anything, because some absences are too large to simply cross off a list. Otis Redding never stood on that stage, but 57 years later, every artist who has ever crossed over, every black voice that primetime television eventually made room for, walked through a door that Otis Redding spent his entire life pushing open. If this story hit you somewhere you were not expecting, and I share it with one person who needs to hear it today. Because Otis Redding spent 6 months standing on the edge of everything he had ever worked for, and the world almost missed the chance to know his name. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the artist who changed music forever and paid a price the world is still not done reckoning with. Drop a comment below and tell us, is there a moment in your own life when the finish line disappeared just before you reached it?